People don't understand time. It's not what you think it is. People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
It's all pretty hard to imagine, but once upon a time, before the massive list of acquisitions that left Microsoft with a laundry list of studios like Bethesda Game Studios, they didn't have that many big exclusives and were honestly seen as losing the so-called console wars. Oh, wait, nah, it's really not that hard. Their introduction to the 8th console generation was abysmal to say the least. On May 21st, 2013, Don Mattrick went on stage for the press conference at Microsoft's headquarters to announce the successor to the hugely popular Xbox 360. If you think that Microsoft has had some failures in the recent past, the Xbox One's generation was a time that began with a controversial launch announcement surrounding the console's always-online requirement, and in Mattrick's own words,
I think people are going to love it, and then they're going to understand what we're trying to create and how it links games and entertainment, the functionality of the box, some of the advantages that you get of having a box that is designed to use an online state. So that, to me, is a future-proof choice, and I think people could have arguably gone the other way if we didn't do it, and fortunately we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360, that's your message if you don't, if you don't like it?
If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device. I mean, seriously, when I read the blogs and thought about who's really the most impacted, there was a person who said, hey, I'm on a nuclear sub, and I don't even know what it means to be on a nuclear sub, but I've got to imagine that it's not easy to get an internet connection.
I mean, the launch had gone so bad that Sony restructured their announcement of the PS4 just to be this level of petty.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
Shortly after this press conference, Mattrick would leave Microsoft and join Zynga as CEO. This disastrous launch, combined with the steep price and always bundled in Kinect, meant that players who wanted a console focused on gaming would gravitate towards Sony's PlayStation 4. 9 months into the generation's life cycle, Phil Spencer was placed as the head of Xbox to replace Jason Holtman and vowed to right the ship. But in order to do that, he would need to give players a reason to stick around and stay on Team Green. For this to work, Xbox would need killer exclusives longer than Crytek's Rise, Son of Rome, and more grounded than Insomniac's wacky Sunset Overdrive. Could their strategy of buying exclusivity from third-party studios be sustainable? Would this be able to dig them out of the hole they're in? Game developers have always strived to capture realistic graphics since that golden age of FMV or full motion video games in the early 90s, creating what were essentially choose-your-own-adventure movies using less pixels than in your smartwatch. But it wasn't their fault. I mean, FMV games did what they could with the hardware they were given. Modern digital media is a far cry from what that was. I mean, look no further than games like the complex Her Story and Late Shift, who are keeping the genre of FMV alive. But as technology behind gaming and computer electronics advanced, computer-generated graphics became the go-to for producing lifelike environments and characters. Polygon counts increased, and you're now able to render incredible scenery. Throughout the industry, development teams race to best each other and make the most lifelike graphics, textures, and character models, all while pushing the hardware they were limited by to the brink. As console generations went by and developers gained access to more and more powerful hardware, graphical fidelity improved by leaps and bounds. In the lead up to the 8th console generation, Microsoft needed to restructure and needed a killer app. They needed something to bring players to the Xbox One. And in April of 2016, Remedy released Quantum Break, a groundbreaking Microsoft exclusive title mixing action gameplay with a full Hollywood-scale television show. The companion TV show explored the world mostly through the eyes of side characters and how your actions through gameplay had an impact on their lives. This was the first time that I've ever personally seen this implemented in a video game. While game directors like Hideo Kojima and Neil Druckmann have brought full cinematic beauty to long drawn-out cutscenes that help bring more exposition to their stories, I don't believe anyone had thought to use a real television show to explain what was going on throughout the world. In the television show, you were nothing more than a side character yourself. Now, my knowledge on this claim in particular is solely based on experience rather than too much research, so be sure to correct me in the comments because I find games like this really interesting, so if I don't know one, let me know. Sam Lake and his team at Remedy were able to team up with world-class actors Aidan Gillen, Shawn Ashmore, Dominic Monaghan, and Lance Riddick to craft a well-mapped-out experience that spans across both intended mediums really well. After finishing an act in-game, you come to an inflection point, and you decide which route to take, which chooses which version of that episode to play for you. But how did they do this? In theory, you would start with a storyboard. So when writing a normal story, you have a linear line. Generally, you can either write it chronologically, that is from beginning to end, or write the beginning and end first and figure out how to do the middle. When you have a game with decisions as vast as Quantum Break here, things change just a little bit. Firstly, you have to have a start. Then, you find out your multiple endings and what decisions the player needs to make to see those endings. The more endings you have and the more decisions you give the player, the more branches need to be made to get to that endpoint. So from a storyboarding standpoint, the approach that Remedy took is nothing new. I mean, hell, look at Baldur's Gate 3. Larian coded in close to 1,000 different endings. What are 4 little decisions doing to make this game anything more than a standard run-of-the-mill power-driven shooter? So you finally finish the chapter and you reach that magical point where you must make a game-changing decision that leads to a nearly 30-minute television episode, showing you how your decision changed the world around you. And speaking of the world, at least it's an interesting one.
The number one killer is time. It destroys us all. This is what you need to know. Time broke. A growing fracture leading to the end of time. We went after a device that could fix it. Things turned ugly. Pulseframe was there to stop us. He has superpowers.
Jack.
Him and me both. We failed.
Jack.
And of course, time travel was involved.
Jack.
Going too fast for you?
As you make your way through the game, you find what are called narrative objects that actually make tiny changes in the TV show. In the first section, I found a collectible that caused Will, Jack's brother, to finish an equation that he found on a whiteboard. This then causes a blink and you miss it line about two scientists talking in the Monarch cafeteria about the oddly solved equation. I mean, it wasn't there whenever they left. There was even a sign that I saw glitching during the gameplay of Chapter 3 that disappeared whenever I touched it. When the TV episode was playing, it randomly appeared in the background, even leading the characters to acknowledge it. These interactive objects don't affect the overall story or ending at all, but they're just collectibles found that make your time as Jack Joyce all its own. I mean, after all, when you mess with time, it gets all wibbly wobbly and timey-wimey. That's just the beginning of the story that Jack Joyce is dragged into. I remember playing this game when it first came out on Xbox One. I chose all of the choices as if I were Paul Serene trying to save my friendship with Jack. I did the 100% personal route that saw Paul focusing on his friendship with Jack rather than tending to his company. The decision not only made an impact on how the story pans out, but they can also affect the gameplay difficulty later on. During my first playthrough, I had 2 in-game boss fights rather than just one, and the final boss fight was much harder. Instead of acting in the best interest of Monarch, the decisions I had Paul choose gave him somewhat of a redemption arc before succumbing to his mind. This made him much stronger for the fights ahead, but in my second playthrough, I chose what best suited the company, and let me tell you, this drove the story to a much darker place. Paul's paranoia grew, and he very quickly went mad with power and paranoia. Personally, I much preferred this dark tale of deception over personal gain, and it shows what happens as the human mind slowly begins ripping itself apart. As the game progresses, Jack learns more and more ways to control his powers, giving him new abilities. As your abilities evolve, your enemy's technology evolves too, getting stronger and giving the ability to move within time stutters just like you can. Monarch has been preparing for the end of time ever since Paul Serene went forward in time during the very first experiment. Quantum Break's gameplay for the most part is a pretty solid third-person shooter, but it's far from a perfect one. The platforming sections are worked beautifully into the world's environmental designs, but because of the wonky layout, the verticality is extremely limited, making it almost impossible to get on top of things that you're not supposed to in order to solve the puzzles the exact correct way. But, just in perfect Remedy fashion, the shooting and time-bending powers seem to overshadow these flaws for the most part. I only seem to remember that the problems with platforming existed when they popped up. The shooting mechanics are very reminiscent of Max Payne without the bullet dodge, which is where Jack's time-bending powers come into play. The coolest of which, for me, is Time Rush, allowing Jack to run outside of time, escaping mortal danger and moving between cover. While using this ability, though, you can melee attack enemies, instantly taking them out of the fight for good. The platforming, like I said though, feels like a rushed addition to the game. You don't have a very high jump, and you can't climb on everything, which kind of gives the game a false sense of scale. While there are moments in the game that make the platforming feel cinematic and well thought out, others make it seem like they didn't put enough thought into it. That honestly was my biggest gripe of the game overall, but really the game is a jack of all trades and a master of none. Luckily, the enemy variety is quite spectacular. Besides the normal goons and their upgraded Spec Ops partners, they have these things called shifters. Now, shifters are created when scientists exposed to the chronon particles for too long begin to transform. They become beings that exist outside of time, beasts that are truly terrifying to encounter. and it honestly sets the stage for a thrilling conclusion and possible terrifying boss fight that unfortunately never really happens. It builds up to something that may have been cut content, but it's never really shown outside of what it can do to the NPC enemies. Honestly, that's a very big missed opportunity for me. It seems like they used it to set up a sequel that just never showed up. But for what it was, Quantum Break is one of the few Xbox One exclusives that made excellent use of the power under the hood of the original Xbox One. With crisp photorealistic details and tight gunplay, Quantum Break helps add more value to your purchase of the Xbox One, even if it isn't itself a system seller. I mean, it was even on PC at launch. And after Halo's unceremonious fall from grace, the Xbox brand has been looking for a killer IP to bring players over to the Team Green side of the toxic console wars that their latest attempt, Bethesda's Starfield, failed to do. Which, hey, at least they're trying to do it in-house rather than have third-party developers build their brands for them.